1977. Fiordland. A team of wildlife workers making their way through valleys that almost no one will ever see in one of the most remote corners of New Zealand's South Island. Steep bush, wet rock, the sound of a creek somewhere below them in the dark. They were looking for something the wildlife officers in Wellington had largely written off. They found five Kakapo in those mountains. Ancient birds. The largest parrot alive and the only one that does not fly. Moss-green feathers, heavy as a full-grown house cat, heavier in the biggest individuals. Each one smelling faintly of something sweet that does not belong to a creature that has spent 70 million years on the ground. 5 birds, in a mountain range that was once thick with them. The team wrapped them carefully, loaded them into crates, and moved them to a small island off the coast of Stewart Island. A piece of forested ground that nobody had ever wanted for anything practical. Predator cleared. The sea on every side. 5 birds. That was the ark. That was 1977. When I looked up the current count last year, the number I found was not the one I expected. I have spent a long time in the field watching land and the creatures on it try to come back from damage. I have watched things that should have recovered fail, and I have watched things that should have failed hold on. You learn after a while not to assume you know which way a story is going to go. When I found the Kakapo count, I went back and checked the source twice. This story ends with a number. I am going to hold that number back until the point where it belongs, because if I give it to you now, it will not carry the weight it should. What I can tell you is that it starts with 18 confirmed birds, and 5 of them on an island nobody wanted, and a group of people who decided that 18 was not the end of the sentence. If you had asked anyone in the New Zealand wildlife community in 1970 what was going to happen to the Kakapo, the honest answer would have been, probably nothing good. A handful of birds in the Fiordland hills, breeding females that nobody could confirm, and a population elsewhere in the country that had not survived intact. Just those mountains, and whatever was still hiding in them. They were almost right. But almost is the word the Kakapo's history turns on. The Kakapo carries 70 million years of evolutionary history. The lineage goes back to islands that had no land predators, no mammals moving through the undergrowth at night hunting anything close to the ground. The bird adapted to that world precisely. It grew large, because size was an advantage on land where nothing hunted it. The biggest individuals weigh close to 9 pounds. It stopped flying, the way a road loses traffic when there is nowhere left it needs to go. It became slow, patient, and extraordinarily long-lived. A Kakapo that survives its early years can live 60 or 70 years, and that span had been the species' great strength. It had become, in short, perfectly suited to a world that was about to disappear. And nothing had been killing it. For 70 million years, nothing had. Polynesian settlers arrived in New Zealand around 800 years ago. They brought Kiore with them, Pacific rats, packed into the canoes that crossed the ocean from East Polynesia. Those rats stepped ashore into an ecosystem that had never produced anything like them. The Kakapo's response to threat was to go still and trust its green coloring to disappear it into the forest floor. That strategy had worked against every aerial predator these islands had ever produced, across millions of years of testing. Against a rat moving through the dark, following a scent trail to a nest, it was no strategy at all. European settlers arrived in the 1800s with their own cargo: cats, stoats, ferrets, weasels, dogs trained to find ground-dwelling birds and drive them from cover. Animals that could work through dense undergrowth in the dark, follow a scent for miles, and reach a nesting bird before it had any reason to move. The Kakapo had no answer for any of them. It had never needed one. I mean, think about that for a second. A species that had survived every ice age and every geological shift those islands had ever seen, across 70 million years, brought to the edge by animals that arrived in a boat. By the early 1900s, the Kakapo was gone from the North Island, gone from most of the South. The populations that early European settlers had written about in their journals had collapsed so completely and so quickly that even the settlers who had seen them could barely account for what had happened. By the mid-1970s, there were 18 confirmed birds, mostly male, scattered across the Fiordland wilderness where the terrain was rugged enough to slow the stoat population, barely. 18 is not a population. 18 is a count of the kind that tells you the ending has probably already been written. 18 birds, spread across hundreds of square miles of steep mountain country, mostly male, no confirmed nesting in the area, and the predator pressure unchanged. A species in its final accounting. The same mountains that had given the Kakapo its last refuge were also the reason recovery seemed nearly impossible. The terrain was too remote to monitor consistently. The population was too scattered to manage. The landscape that had slowed the predators enough to leave a few birds alive was the same landscape that made it almost impossible to do anything useful for those birds. Someone had to make a different call. A unit within the New Zealand Wildlife Service had been studying Kakapo for years by the time the count reached 18. Close work, on foot, through the bush. Learning when the birds nested and where, what they ate, why they only bred in certain years when the rimu tree produced a heavy crop of fruit, what the early chick survival rate looked like under different conditions. They understood the biology of this species better than anyone had before them. They also understood that passive protection at a count of 18 was going to change nothing. What the bird needed was a real island, surrounded by water, cleared of introduced species and kept clear, where the Kakapo could exist without the constant pressure that had reduced the mainland population to 18 birds and still dropping. This decision seemed small at the time. Consequential decisions often do. A few people, a remote piece of ground, 5 birds. Codfish Island, known in Maori as Whenua Hou, sits in the waters near Stewart Island, at the southern end of New Zealand. Small, forested. The land offered nothing useful to anyone who had ever looked at it for farming or trade, and no scenery dramatic enough to bring visitors from the mainland. Nobody had wanted it, which was exactly what made it available. The team cleared the island of predators, and then maintained that clearance season after season, because an island is not sealed against the sea. A single stoat arriving by swimming or on driftwood can undo years of work. A condition you sustained, not a project you finished. In 1977, 5 Kakapo went into crates and moved to Codfish Island, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. At 18 confirmed birds, there was no margin for a failed experiment. Island transfers can fail. Predator incursions can happen. Animals do not always adapt to new environments on the timeline the people moving them would prefer. The margin was as close to zero as it could get. These birds survived. Surviving opened the door. What came next required something altogether different. Moving 5 birds to a safe island was one step in what turned out to be a decades-long undertaking. The Kakapo bred slowly. It bred rarely, only in the years when the rimu produced heavily enough to support the energy demands of raising young. A female who chose to breed in a given season faced months of intensive effort. In a population this small, losing even one bird to a preventable cause set things back by years. And a species with a lifespan measured in decades, breeding infrequently, in small numbers, cannot absorb setbacks the way a fast-producing species can. So they managed the birds as individuals, in a way that had not been tried with any parrot before, and rarely with any wild bird species at all. Every bird got a name, a transmitter, and a file. Rangers tracked the transmitters on foot through the bush at night, because Kakapo are nocturnal and the undergrowth on those islands is dense enough to disorient a person quickly. Supplemental feeding stations were built and stocked across Codfish Island, providing the high-energy food the birds needed in years when the Rimu was producing poorly. Nest sites were located and monitored closely. When eggs were at risk from temperature drops at night, while the mother left to feed, people went to the nest. When chicks needed to be hand-reared, they were hand-reared. What comes next is the part that still does not fit neatly into what I expected from a species at that count. The Kakapo responded. Slowly, with setbacks, with seasons that failed and seasons that produced chicks against the odds, the numbers moved. More birds were found and transferred as the survey work continued and the program expanded. But the transfers alone were not what built the recovery. The detail that turned out to matter most was what the sustained monitoring revealed. Which interventions actually produced chicks that survived, and which ones did not. Season by season, the program built a body of knowledge about what intensive conservation for a species at the edge actually required. But this was not just about the Kakapo anymore. The methods that developed through the 1980s and 1990s, the individual tracking systems, the nest management protocols, the genetic record-keeping that traced every bird's lineage spread outward. Work done on an island nobody wanted became a reference that traveled to conservation teams facing their own critical numbers situations in other countries. An experiment on a piece of ground nobody had ever coveted turned into a model. If the program had stopped in the mid-1990s, this would be a very different story. The bird was far from secure. Stoat incursions remained a real risk. Breeding seasons depended on Rimu fruiting, which is irregular and cannot be predicted with confidence. The genetic base was narrow enough that every pairing decision carried inbreeding risk. Individual animals still mattered more than any healthy population ever needs to matter. The work continued anyway. The commitment held. And the version of this story that the world outside these islands largely missed is really about what it looks like when a conservation program decides that the count at which it finds a species is not the count at which that species has to end. And that was not even the piece of it that changed the final number. By the time I checked the count last year, the Kakapo population had passed 250 individuals. 250. From 18 birds. From 5 on an island nobody had wanted for anything. That kind of number deserves a moment. 250 birds in managed island refuges, maintained by active predator control, still dependent on the program's continued effort to survive, is a species in mid-crossing. The journey is real. But it is also a number that could not have come from anywhere except 1977, and 5 birds in crates, and a piece of ground nobody wanted. Every one of those 250-plus birds has a name, a weight history from birth, a genetic record tracking its lineage through the program's decades of data. The oldest animals alive today were alive when the recovery effort was new. Some were among the first birds ever transferred to those island refuges. They are still there. As of last year, the Kakapo count stood above 250. The program that started with 5 birds on an island nobody wanted has been running for close to 50 years. The work continues. I have spent a long time thinking about what recovery stories like this one prove and what they do not. A population of 250 individuals held in managed refuges, maintained by sustained human effort, still at risk from a single bad stoat season or a breeding failure in the wrong year, is a species still in mid-crossing, still dependent on the people who built this program and the ones who came after them. But here is what it does prove, and I find it more useful than the larger claim. It proves that the line between recoverable and gone is not always where it looks when the count is 18, or when it is 5. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. And what the Kakapo story keeps showing me is that the animal did its part. The team cleared the island, moved the birds, managed the nests, ran the program through decades of seasons when the world outside these islands was not watching. But the Kakapo survived. It bred. It built the number from 5 to something that looks, for the first time in any record anyone has kept, like it might be enough to work with. 5 birds. That is where it started. If these recovery stories have been worth your time, there is one thing I would ask. Subscribe. There are more of them, and I will keep bringing them as long as there are people who want to hear about them. And if there is a place near you that came back from something, leave it in the comments. I read them. One more. If what we covered today, this shape of story, island by island, species by species, is something you want to keep following, there is a video on the screen right now about another island clearance on the other side of the world from New Zealand. In 2014, the last rabbit was removed from a subantarctic island that had been stripped nearly bare over a century of occupation. And what the slopes did in the years after that is worth seeing. Tap it.